It's April 2022, and the world's been living with the COVID-19 virus for over 2 years. Waves of quarantines and lockdowns and virus variants have washed up over the shores of the United States for more than 24 months. It's been a lot for everybody to deal with. It's been trying, it's been difficult, and it's been isolating in every sense of the word. You can be easily forgiven for not remembering every twist and turn this pandemic has taken, or even for forgetting what happened on what date or month or even year. And you can also be forgiven for forgetting how strong you've had to be for yourself and for others just to make it this far when so many others haven't. But what you might need is a reminder that even with the nearly 1 million deaths in the United States since early 2020, there have been some individuals that have gone above and beyond the call to aid their neighbors, the country, and the world at a very dark time. Writer and journalist for The Atlantic and Politico, Kathy Gilsinan, has penned that reminder. Her book, The Helpers, Profiles from the Front Lines of the Pandemic, weaves the stories of a CEO of a small ventilator manufacturer, a country-crossing paramedic, a devoted son, a chef and culinary teacher, a vaccine researcher, an ICU nurse, and more to take the reader back to the first chapter of the coronavirus pandemic, from when so much was novel and uncertain, and eventually to when the first inoculations were being distributed to the whole country and ready to be injected into arms. Now, we'll hear about two of the people from The Helpers, find out how the writer was able to get the stories still mid-pandemic, and how her regular reporting beat of international affairs and politics turned into a search for hope and the best in Americans during a very trying time. A discussion with author Kathy Gilsinan about her book, The Helpers, brought to you by HEC Media, the St. Louis County Library, and The Novel Neighbor is next. Hello, Kathy Gilsinan. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. You chose a very interesting way to, I think, tell the tale of what I've been calling the first season, basically, of the pandemic. You looked in this new book, I guess, really starting from around February or March in 2020 until effectively, let's call it February or March of 2021, through the stories of individuals of a lot of different backgrounds from around the United States. How did you pick the people that you profiled in your book?
The premise of the book was to try to find, this was a moment when I was working on the book proposal. This was probably around early March, so things were just starting to shut down. And in tandem with that, you were seeing all these horrifying predictions about death tolls and things like that, but you were also seeing this kind of flowering of civic in-it-togetherness. You remember people thought they were really clever, saying like, oh, we're in this together even though we're 6 feet apart kind of thing. And you had people just coming up with ways to support each other. So there were mutual aid groups popping up. There were people sewing masks for their neighbors. So anyway, the idea was to really highlight people who were helping, who were trying to, amidst all this chaos and terror, who were trying to do the right thing for the community, especially in the midst of sort of what was becoming clearly at that point already becoming a shambolic federal response. So I knew that I wanted to profile a nurse, somebody in the healthcare community, and I sort of went by profession and by geography. So I knew, I needed to hit New York because that was at the time the epicenter of the epicenter. I wanted to hit the Midwest because there was there were different dynamics going on there, similarly with the West Coast, similarly with the South, and then I was sort of approaching it along the lines of profession, right? So someone in healthcare, someone who was trying to feed the hungry because there was economic devastation happening in tandem with all this health devastation. And then just, some of them were just crazy stories. So, the race for ventilators, the race for vaccines. So that's sort of how it all came together in the thinking.
So can you tell me about maybe one or two of the people that you do profile who you call the helpers, the people who went a little above and beyond to try to help the population at large?
Sure. One of the people that I decided to profile very early on, and just on the basis of having read about him in a newspaper, was a guy named Paul Carey, who is a paramedic in Colorado with former firefighter, walrus mustache, which you could see in pictures of him. And he had been part of this just extraordinary effort, again, early on in the pandemic, when New York is the epicenter. And the paramedics and the 911 system are totally overwhelmed. So there was this mutual aid effort organized by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to get ambulance drivers from all around the country to go to New York and help out. So people came driving their ambulances across the country from Virginia, Tennessee, Illinois, Colorado. So he drives his ambulance. He's 66 years old, got a bad back, got some health problems, drives his ambulance across the country at a time when Colorado is not experiencing a lot of COVID, but decides I need to drive into the fire because this is what I do, and starts helping out in New York. And then I think one of the other people whose story I was really struck by was this woman, Hamilton Bennett, who she's a little bit younger than me, so she was about 35 around this time. And she's a scientist. She's working at a biotech in Boston that nobody's ever heard of at that point. And it's never brought anything to market. Its technology is like a little bit, nobody really knows what it is. It's losing money hand over fist. And she early on in the before it was a pandemic even, convinced her bosses to basically put the company on the line in a race for a vaccine at a time when no one knew if this was actually going to be a pandemic. Is this going to burn out in a couple of months? And that company was Moderna. And she was, this young woman, she was the person who basically drove that vaccine program.
So let's talk about her story in particular. How was she such a helper at Moderna? Now we know that name, but nobody knew what Moderna was before that.
Her odyssey started in the most mundane of ways, which was with an email. She got copied on an email from a guy at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He had noticed a Wall Street Journal story about this mysterious new illness in China. And nobody knew what it was, and there were not good numbers coming out about it, and it had sickened a few people. And Hamilton, meanwhile, had been working on trying to figure out basically a test virus to get a vaccine as fast as you could. And she had tried to do this with Zika virus and had spent 18 months working toward this vaccine, and then found out in clinical trials that it didn't work because they'd made some mistake in the programming earlier. She was already trying to figure out a way to just demonstrate that their technology could, with a sample virus, could go from, as soon as we get the genetic code of the virus, we can very rapidly move to a vaccine, which is not something that we have been able to do as a human race before, because the prior record speed for vaccine development and bringing it to market was 4 years for the mumps vaccine. So she's already primed to look for this, and she thinks, maybe this thing will be something we can work with, not thinking this is going to change everybody's life. So she gets on the phone with the folks at NIAID, and they start talking about, okay, well, we'll wait for the genetic sequence to come out, and then we'll see what it is. We'll see what we can experiment with. So I think by mid-January, they actually had a formula for a vaccine, which is crazy. And then much of the timeline from there was just figuring out how to get it tested, get it approved. So, you first, you do trials in the lab on animals. Then once you demonstrate safety, then you can start putting it into humans. And those first trials are, those are phase 1 trials. Then you go to phase 2, which is bigger, and you're testing for different things. And phase 3, which is huge, and you're trying to, you're doing it on tens of thousands of people to see if it works. So that whole process was from January 2020 to the emergency use authorization in December. So that was a year. That was less than a year. Mm-hmm. Insane. Mm-hmm. It's never happened before.
The thought of getting it go that, like you said, it's almost 4 times faster than the fastest vaccine that's been developed. How willing was she to talk about it? Was it tough to pull like the struggle that she had to go through and all of that during that whole process? As well as maybe even some of the other people, because this is still raw for everybody. No one's has been left unscathed by this pandemic. Was it easy for her to talk? Do you think it was cathartic for her, or did she feel kind of resistant? And again, that's kind of hard to tell a lot of times over the telephone.
But you can tell people are resistant when they don't talk to you very much. And she was very, again, like leaving aside some of the proprietary stuff that she couldn't talk about. I think she was very reflective on the historic nature of this, and also had some just really interesting. One of the things she told me, because I was trying to get to her background and how she got into this field to begin with, because emerging infectious diseases, if you're going to be working in science, is not necessarily the sexiest field, and it's not necessarily the way to make a ton of money. Mm-hmm. But she, is a do-gooder, bleeding heart public health type. This is what she really wants to do. And she went into science. One of her professors had told her, science, he told her he would never encourage his kids to go into science because the lows are really low and the highs are just all right. And and she went into it anyway, which I thought. And so she's just, she's one of these. She's very charming and self-effacing, and really good at explaining very complicated science to a layperson.
Can we talk a little bit as well about the paramedic from Colorado who made the drive? Can you tell his story a little bit, or at least as you got it through his relative?
He was described to me as the kind of person, and I've heard this from other paramedics that I interviewed as part of this process, that it's sort of a paramedic and emergency services mentality that you want to be there for somebody on their worst day. And so Paul Carey was kind of almost compulsive about this. He worked all the time. His work was his life. He worked when he didn't have to work. So Paul joins this caravan of ambulances driving from Colorado to New York. At the time, the city's totally shut down. So they're able to do, he and his Colorado friends, of whom he's by far the oldest, are able to do some tourism in a shut down city, right? So they're driving around empty Times Square. They go and look at the 9/11 memorial, which is kind of blocked off, but they're able to see they're able to see the memorial to the firefighters who died. And they're able to go to Katz's Delicatessen and get pastrami or whatever. So, and then the out of town ambulances are all staging at the Bronx Zoo, just waiting for calls. And what they're mainly doing is hospital decompression. So they're going to hospitals, overwhelmed hospitals, getting patients out. Sometimes, these, it's beds jammed in hallways. It's sometimes it can take an hour to find the patient because everybody's so overwhelmed. The nurses are mad and harried and scared, and some of them can't go home because they don't want to expose their families. So just this time of total chaos.
How did you get those particular stories? Since you were, it's a spoiler, he did not make it. He actually ended up catching COVID and was, just like you mentioned, he was actually alone. He didn't have any family members there with him, which is the ICU nurses kind of nightmare. How did you get the details of those stories?
It was tricky, partly because there was one person who was Paul's friend, who was on the shifts with him, who was able to fill me in on a lot of those details. And then it was just trying to find other people who had gone on that trip with him and or who had known him in Colorado. So it was a lot of different sources kind of piecing it together. But the scene, the scenes from Times Square and the scenes from Katz's are from people who were there.
That seemed to be, his alternate family that he had, even when he had his biological family back at home.
That's right, and that's a tension in his story too. That there is a sense in which, first of all, the kind of camaraderie forged under circumstances like that, when you all have the same mission and you're all in unfortunately close quarters, given the way the disease works, and you're all part of this crazy historic thing. And you all see each other all the time. that's a real bond that forms. And so it was devastating to the people I talked to who had only known this guy in some cases for a couple of weeks. But like that's really that becomes a brotherhood. But the tension there is that there is, he did have his own family, and there are people you leave behind when you go try to be part of something historic and you take these risks. You're not just taking risks on behalf of yourself. You're gonna leave people behind, and that was a choice that he made. And I think his family struggled with it.
Mm-hmm. So, covering domestic issues wasn't really your beat at the Atlantic before doing this. Why did you decide to cover this only domestically or from the lens of Americans?
I think partly it was a couple of reasons. One was that as the pandemic was starting, I had already kind of started to pivot along with almost everybody else at the Atlantic we were just all COVID all the time. It was all, so I was writing stuff about, China's role in this, and some of the ways in which Chinese propaganda was downplaying the origins of the virus and so on. Then I did a story about National Guardsmen who were in the military band. So, like the tuba player and they got together on orders and built a hospital, a field hospital in like a few days, because at that point, again, National Guards were building hospitals all over the country because with the Army Corps of Engineers, because we thought hospitals were going to be totally overwhelmed. And on the basis of that story about people in military bases, an agent reached out to me and suggested doing a book about helpers of the pandemic. And I thought it was a great idea. And also, for logistical reasons, I think it was narrowed to the United States because the pandemic, obviously it's a pandemic, it's all over the world, but it was experienced so differently across the 50 states, let alone across all the countries in the world. So I just narrowed the focus to the U.S.
So speaking of logistics, how did you actually interview the people? I mean, the two people we've talked about was the woman with Moderna, and then I'm guessing you did not get to speak with the paramedic.
Right, yes.
So how did you actually conduct these interviews?
These were mostly, so in both of these cases, these were phone interviews. And then a few places I did get to go physically see. So I did visit the Bronx hospital where the nurse Michelle Gonzalez works. And I did get to visit the former GM plant in Kokomo, Indiana, where they were churning out ventilators. So it was mostly by phone, but I did manage to do some site visits as well.
Have you reached out and heard anything from any one of the 6 subjects, the 6 different people for sure that you wrote about since the book has come out?
Yes, all the time. There's different. I'd say I'm in like different frequency of contact with different people, but I catch up with Paul Carey's son by phone every once in a while. I was just out in the Bronx with Michelle Gonzalez and some of her friends because she had told me that the last time she really went out before everything shut down, she had gone to the Bronx Ale House and there were bagpipers there. Mm. So I had always said, well, when this is over, before it's over, we'll go to the Bronx Ale House. So I went out, and we'll text occasionally. The person I haven't talked to in a while is Hamilton, but she has transitioned into, she's still at Moderna last time we spoke, and she's transitioned into pandemic preparedness, which is obviously a great job for her, and I like the idea of her helping position us for the next one. But yeah, I came to really, I really like, and I hope it comes through, I really like all of these people a lot, and I feel really lucky that I was able to spend time with them.
As this is kind of ground on for now into our 3rd year, attitudes have kind of changed. Have any of the people that you've reached back out to in the book noticed that change, and have they been affected, or how have they responded to the change in attitudes?
The person I've discussed that with most is Michelle, and when we were at Bronx Ale House, there were a few things. One was that she's always struggled with the hospital itself and with the ways nurses are compensated and the way, and nursing and staffing issues and all of that. I don't know if she ever thought, this crisis moment is going to be a real moment for change and people are going to, but I think she was fighting for it. And I don't think she's very hopeful that the issues that she identified are going to get solved in any reasonable amount of time. But I know she's going to keep advocating. And I wouldn't be surprised if she ends up going into politics or something like that. A thing that was sad and that is happening everywhere that Michelle has not done yet, but one of her friends who was there has quit her hospital, and you do see healthcare workers quitting all over the place. So I haven't talked about the change in attitudes as much with the other people in the book, but that was a very striking story to me.
I have to say the book is mainly void of politics. Was that an active decision, or did it end up that way?
It was an active decision. And I think that the institutional failures and the political toxicity of that time, which are referred to in the book, but not the foreground of the book, those are so well known. And there are going to be so many books, and they're going to be good, about all the ways in which the United States, and particularly its government, failed to meet this challenge. But I thought that the purpose of this book was different. The inevitable background to these individual stories was one of institutional failure. The reason it was going to be hard to have a pandemic no matter what, but part of the reason so many of these people needed to step up and assume the extraordinary risks that they did was because institutions were not doing it for them. So with that background, I felt that these people then were all the more worthy of celebration. And it was also important to me, again, at a moment of political toxicity, to not to tell a partisan morality tale, because, Paul Kerry was a Trump supporter. The nurses who took care of him, some of them were Bernie Sanders people. And it's not like people are checking your voter registration in the ICU, right? Inevitably, this virus, inevitably and unfortunately, the virus polarized people more politically, but it also killed people on both sides of the aisle. And so I felt that I wanted to tell a story about Americans being better than their politics, which I believe to be true, at least in most cases.
So the story ended basically in 2021, like early 2021. Did you decide to stop it then, or did you think it was kind of over, or were you saying, this is done, I'm just putting this to bed?
Well, two things. One is I had a deadline. And actually, speaking of American decency and goodness and politics, I turned in my first draft on January 6th, 2021, which was a very difficult time to make an argument about fundamental American decency. The process was such that it took a few months to do edits and various types of review, but it was pretty much wrapped by the summer. So that was kind of the last time I was able to do updates.
It's a really interesting time capsule that you've been able to put in place, because it's weird to look at it now. We're now in the third year of it, and you kind of stopped the book saying, you even said, oh, the pandemic's over. and this is in February of 2021, and we're not done yet.
Totally. Like many people, when vaccines came out, I took a bit of a premature victory lap. I thought, and you can read it in the epilogue. I'm kind of in a place where, okay, I think I wrote the epilogue in the summer of 2021. So vaccines are rolling out. People, I think most people could get them at that point. And so in my mind, okay, it's just a matter of time before this thing is over. There's a suggestion of new variants happening, but whatever. And so I did think it was over. On the other hand, I do give myself a little credit for hedging my bets because they're, one of the books I drew on a bit just in terms of moral lessons and so on, was Camus' The Plague. And at the end of The Plague, the plague is done. This is a fictional plague. It takes place in the 1940s. At the end of the plague itself is over, but he says something to the effect of there can be no final victory because this thing is lurking in chests and furniture and whatever else. And so, but he does conclude on the note that, in that circumstance, we have people who are going to strive their utmost to be healers. And so I think that's what my book is really about as well. Just that even in place of final victory, it remains important that there are people willing to step up.
And I mean, I do think the whole thing, it does kind of seem like news and journalism is the first rough draft of history, and that's where it is. You do have to put a deadline. You did have to put some sort of stop to it, but clearly the story has continued.
Yeah.
Would you do The Helpers, part 2 in the pandemic cinematic universe? Would you go back and try to recap what happened in the second year, because we still have year 3 coming up?
I would like for people to be interested. I think the challenges are different now, and especially so for someone like if I were going to do the sequel of the Michelle Gonzalez story, this nurse in the Bronx, there was a moment, again, where there was just this intense emotional appreciation for healthcare workers. So back in March 2020, April 2020, people in New York would lean out of their windows and applaud, nurses coming off shift changes and so on. Nurses are still doing the same kind of work, but that moment has faded. People are meaner now, to their nurses. I've heard stories. I was just in the Bronx the other week and hearing stories about just people berating the nurses because they had to wait too long for care or whatever. So they're still overwhelmed, but now there's not as much of that countervailing healthcare heroes feeling. And so in some ways, the pandemic itself is more manageable and we know more about it now, but some things are harder.
But I think your book is important to have taken that sort of snapshot of the outlook we had, because when I was reading it, I remember thinking, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that part, that episode, or the way you thought, we're back in the banana bread baking phase and all these other different things. You forget all the different specific sort of zones, because in many ways to most people, that 2 years, it's just all kind of mashed together. And even reading the book, I remember thinking, why haven't you talked about Omicron yet? I was like, oh, that was a whole year.
Yeah.
That was way after any of this happened, and even
totally.
after the book is over.
Yeah, it was wrapped. I think it was wrapped before Delta happened. I think that if I had written the book proposal maybe even a few months later, it would have probably been a different book.
I think it's by the nature of the way the pandemic has sort of shown itself. There's no end point. It's not done. So if you were to write another book, this is your first book, your first nonfiction book,
yeah,
is that right?
my first book, yeah.
So
I like how you call it my first, as if I'll do it again.
Well, that's my question. Are you going to do you have another book in mind, or have you ever thought of writing another one?
I would love to write another one. This process was, as my family can tell you, it's do you know the concepts of type 1 and type 2 fun?
Go ahead and tell me.
Okay, so type 1 fun is fun while you're doing it, like eating a pastrami sandwich from Katz's Delicatessen and trying to figure out how to get the whole thing in your face. Type 2 fun is only fun after you've done it, so you hike up a mountain and it's terrible and you're wheezing and you get to the top and you're like, that was great, let's do it again. So the book was definitely type 2 fun, and there were so many days, which I can't even remember now because of the way memory kind of elides these things. But there were so many days of just existential dread and panic and, oh my God, these people are not going to return my phone call and I can't write if I don't talk. But then when I'm writing and I have all this stuff, oh, I'm such a terrible writer. This is never going to work. I can't believe anybody pays me money to do this. I'm terrible. I'm the worst. I've made all the wrong decisions. You don't need my whole inner monologue. But But then it's out, and I'm like, oh, that was great. Let's do that again. I would love to do it again. I didn't even, this was not my idea, this book. And so I'll just have to get back together with Bridget and see if she has, see if she has another idea. I think I would like to write a book about the Midwest, but I don't know what it would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Kathy Gilsinan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Okay.